Good morning. Today we commence the inquest into the death of Michael Clarke. Ms Stevens.
Thank you, Your Honour. This is the inquest into the death of Michael Clarke. Michael was a resident of Bumbo near Bordalla, and he died after the fire reached his property on 23 January 2020. Your Honour may recall from the evidence in regard to the Badger Forest fire that the fire started on 27 December 2019, burnt fiercely for the first few days, and in particular on 31 December. The fire continued to burn more steadily for some weeks, but due to a change in weather conditions, there was a sudden and severe progression of the fire on 23 January. It is in these circumstances in which Michael died. To say something about Michael, Your Honour, I start by saying he had 4 siblings and he grew up moving all around Australia with his parents. Both of his parents were in the Air Force. Michael's siblings and mother are all very involved in these proceedings and are watching this hearing remotely. We take this opportunity to acknowledge the tragic circumstances of Michael's death and the loss to the Clarke family and Michael's friends. It's appropriate here to cite a comment made by Shane Clarke, Michael's brother, where he said in his statement to police, "Michael was a top older brother. He always took care of us. He always wanted to help people out. He did a lot of timber work down at the Bumbo property. He had his own equipment there and cut slabs. He was pretty happy living there on his own and doing his own thing. He did his woodwork and stayed out on the land. He occasionally used to go into town to shop or play bowls, but he spent most of his time out there." He was well familiar with that area, Your Honour. In the 1970s, the family settled in Browley. He found himself drawn back to the general South Coast area, and in his late 20s, he purchased his property in Bumbo with an old friend, Paul van der Heuvel. The property was about 130 hectares of dense bushland. Michael built a house on a parcel of cleared land at the top of a steep hill on the property. Paul also built his own house on a separate clearing. For many years, Michael lived there, and for a period he had a partner, Pam, who tragically died from cancer in 2013. After Pam's death, Michael continued to live on the property by himself. In the months prior to the fires, Michael had not been well. The brief of evidence includes medical records relating to Michael and show that he presented himself to Moruya Hospital on New Year's Day on 2020. He stayed there for a week and was transferred to Canberra Hospital for further tests. The evidence also contains medical records from Canberra Hospital. The evidence will likely show that on the 19th of January, Michael discharged himself against medical advice from Canberra and went and stayed at his sister's house in Yarralumla. As his brother Shane put it, Michael did the runner from the hospital. The brief contains detailed statements from a number of members of Michael's family in regard to their concerns about his physical health and his mental health. These concerns will be the subject of some further investigation by police. For this reason, Your Honour, the court will hear evidence today only about the circumstances of Michael's death on his property from the fires. At the conclusion of the evidence in this matter, an application will be made today for an adjournment in order for the police to undertake these inquiries. It is proposed that the inquest into the death of Michael Clarke be adjourned, part heard, to a convenient date for further hearing. To return to the chronology of events in Michael's last days, following his departure from Canberra Hospital and his brief stay at his sister's house. He caught a bus to his mother's house in Tomakin on the south coast. His mother, Ingrid, has provided a statement to the court. She says that over the 2 days that he stayed with her, Michael seemed okay, but was insistent on getting back to his property in Bumbo. On Wednesday, the 22nd of January, Michael's brother Shane and their friend Brad Dunn, picked him up from his mother's house and drove Michael back to his property. They spent the day with him and left the property at about 8 p.m. The neighbouring property in Bumbo belonged to the Eder family. It is not possible to see the Clark dwelling from the Eder property. The bushland is very dense. Your Honour, we will show a map of the properties taken by investigating police or obtained by investigating police. Your Honour will see on the map on the screen, the left is the Eder property with a number of dwellings, and then at the top right, the Vander Heuvel property, and that's Paul, Michael's friend, and then on the right at the bottom is Michael's property, which was the smallest of the three. And Your Honour can see the dense bushland in that regard. The evidence before the court is that the Eders, namely Robert and his wife, did not know that Michael had returned to his property in January. They believed he was still in hospital in Canberra. In this regard, I read a paragraph from the statement of Brad Dunn, one of those friends who took Michael back to his property. He says that about 7 p.m, and that's 7 p.m. on the 22nd of January, Shane and I said goodbye to Mick. I remember the dog wanted to come with us in the car, which was very strange to me. Evie was very much Mick's dog, but seemed unsettled. I don't know if dogs have a sixth sense when it comes to fire or anything, but I remember that it wanted to come with us. I wanted to go and tell the neighbours, Barbara and Robert, that he was back at home. Mick told us not to. He said, "Nup, I just want to be on my own for a few days." Robert Eder will give evidence shortly in these proceedings. The following day, 23 January, at around mid-morning, Shane contacted his brother to check up on him, particularly because he was well aware of the weather forecast for that day, a forecast of 38 degrees. Shane called Michael on his landline. He did not have a mobile. And Michael told him that everything was fine and the fires were not in his immediate area. At around 12:30 that day, Robert and Barbara Eder were also on their property, and they were informed by the RFS at that time that there was fire activity in the area and the threat was increasing. They were told that they needed to decide whether to stay or whether to leave. Robert remained at his property with his cattle in order to protect them. Later that afternoon, at about 2:40, Shane called Michael again because he was aware that the conditions had worsened. Shane has provided a statement to police. And in that statement, in particular, he comments on that exchange on that day. Shane says, "I woke up," this is on the 23rd of January, "I woke up and heard it was going to be 38 degrees that day. I rang him and he answered and said everything was fine and that he had just got up, had brekkie and a cuppa and fed the dogs. At that time there had been a lot of fires in the area, but nothing immediately close that would cause any harm. I knew, and so did Michael, that the fireys had been clearing a fire break with bulldozers out the back of Bob and Barbara's farm, but I don't know exactly where it was. It was somewhere to the west. I took the dogs for a walk around Browley and the wind was getting heavier and hotter. By that time it was about 38 degrees and a howling westerly. There was a lot of residual smoke coming across Tomakin, which was from the fires we had earlier that month. I got a call from Brad, and that's Brad Dunn, who said he had just spoken to someone in town who said that Maria was on fire and they were evacuating, and said to get a hold of Michael or get down there. I left where I was and I went back to Mum's, and his mum, Your Honour, was in Tomakin. A mate of mine from up north, Tom Ward from Ballina, was staying at a caravan park at Browley. I didn't have enough fuel in my car, so I grabbed him. We had a hire car full of fuel and got him to take me down there. I rang Michael before we left Browley on the landline from my mobile, and I pause, Your Honour, and say that the police records demonstrate this was about 2:40 in that afternoon. It took him a fair while to answer. I asked, "Are you all right? What's it like down there?" He said, "Yeah, I think it's coming. The shed's just lit up. It was a grass fire before that." I said, "What shed?" He said, "The original one I lived in when we built the joint." And Shane said, "You're shitting me. That's only 10 metres from your house. Are you going to be all right?" And he said, "Yeah, I think so. I got to get back out there." And we ended the call. Your Honour, tragically, this was the last time that Shane and police believe anybody spoke with Michael on that day. Shane made tremendous attempts to contact others in the surrounding areas to assist Michael. He called Robert Eder later that afternoon. It was during this phone call that Robert was informed by Shane that Michael was in fact on the property. Following this phone call, Robert got on his quad bike and attempted to get up to Michael's house at great risk to himself. By this stage, the fire had reached both of their properties and he could not get to Michael's. Throughout the late of the afternoon, Shane was himself in danger from the fires, but he and his friends still attempted to get down to Bumbo on the highway. They got to the Bumbo Road turnoff and spoke with some RFS members in a fire truck. Shane was informed by the RFS that, in their words, they had just pulled all their fire trucks out of there and there was no way he would be able to get up there towards Michael's property. The court will hear from Robert Eder that when he was able to get back to Michael's property, it was burnt to the ground. Your Honour, I show the court some photos of Michael's property after the fire went through. In the early hours of the following day, the 24th of January, Hayden van der Heuvel, that's Paul's son, drove to his father's property in the knowledge that it had probably been damaged by fire. The fire had passed through, but the conditions were still dangerous. In his statement, he said, as he drove up into the general property area, "All I could see was fire and flames. The weather conditions at the time were calm, but I knew that the main fire front had passed as everything in its path had burnt. The surroundings were apocalyptic and it looked like hell." Hayden surveyed the damage done to his father Paul's property and walked to Michael's house and saw the same image that Robert had seen and that Your Honour has just seen in those photographs. Early in that morning, Hayden made his way to the Eder farm and saw Robert. Hayden spoke with Shane on the phone and asked after Michael, given he had just been to his property. Shane asked Hayden to return to Michael's property and check the bathroom area of the house because, in his words, it was always Mick's plan to sit in the shower if a fire ever came through the area. Hayden returned to the property and tragically located remains under some corrugated sheeting. Later that afternoon, New South Wales Police attended the area and they recovered remains that were later confirmed to be Michael's. The attending officer, Senior Constable, has this to say. Upon arrival at the property, it was immediately clear the entire property had been impacted by fire. All the tress and undergrowth were burned ash over the ground. The vehicles that I had seen a few days earlier at the property were all burned out. The dwelling was completely burned out and razed to the ground. Twisted lengths of corrugated iron lay where the dwelling had stood. The shed was also destroyed. The only portion of the home that appeared relatively intact was the brick chimney along with the concrete water tank. No person was present at the location. Your Honour, I call Robert Eder.
Sorry, just before you do call Mr. Eder.
Yes, Your Honour.
Ms. Stevens, I understand that there's an issue with the YouTube
I see.
streaming, so we'll just take a short adjournment.
Yes.
Please, I'll stand as time until temporary adjourn.
thank you. And apologies for that little break. I'm assured that everything's running smoothly now.
Thank you, and I believe it is. I call Robert Eder.
Mr. Eder, can you see and hear us? Mr. Eder, can you see and hear us?
Yeah, I can see and hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
All right.
We'll just hear from the court officer now. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Eder, I'm going to swear you in. Do you wish to take the oath or the affirmation?
The affirmation, please.
Silence, please. Do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say I do.
I do.
Ms. Stevens.
Sir, will you give your full name to the court, please?
Robert Edward Eder.
Have you made a statement to police in regard to the death of Michael Clark in June of last year?
Yes, I did.
Mr. Eder, I'd like to ask you some questions about the fires that came through your property and Michael's in January of 2020. I'll start by asking you about your property. You own a dairy farm in the Bumbo area, is that right?
That's correct.
Can you tell the court about the size of your farm and the topography?
It's 414 hectares, and it's predominantly bush land of that. Well, in acres, it's about 650 acres of bush and 300 odd acres of open land, 350 of open land. So, and it starts, like the easternmost part of our property is actually the brackish part of Bumbo Creek. So it kind of goes from like creek flats, and as you go west, it is actually the foothills of the Great Dividing Range. So the west boundary of our property is the Dampier State Forest, and west of that is just continuous bush for a considerable distance. So we're kind of backed up against the bush, and then our farm is the tillable land or the open land is basically runs along Bumbo Creek, going from the tidal limit is kind of right where the buildings are. And then as you go west, it's fresh. And so there's like creek valleys, level creek valleys that have been, that's what we use for our dairy pastures.
And is the neighbouring property that belonging to Michael Clark?
Well, that's actually east of the creek where I spoke. There's a bridge that crosses the creek as you kind of go into where our property is, and then Michael's property is on a ridge on the east side of the creek. So it's quite a steep ridge, and that's all also heavily forested or bushland that kind of runs along the north side of Bumbo Road. So he lived on top of a ridge where his property and his house was, surrounded by bush, but only a few hundred meters from our property.
Well, that was my next question. What do you estimate is the distance between your property and Michael Clark's, your house and Michael Clark's house?
Probably about 350 meters.
And could you see his property from yours?
We could see if there was a light on. Because it was so heavily bush, you really couldn't see the dwelling, so to speak, because he was surrounded by bush. But if he, like in the morning, quite often they got up early as well, and we could see like the porch light, so to speak, from our property, but we couldn't really see the house itself.
And you had known Michael reasonably well because you'd bought that farm in 2005, is that right?
That's correct.
In your statement, you say to the police, I've always found Michael to be a friendly character, a good neighbour, and I always felt like he was interested in what I was talking about. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, we got along very well with Michael.
About how regularly would you see him?
Oh, well, we might run into him oddly, but I'd go visit him, every couple of weeks, probably on a pretty regular basis, just to see how he was doing. Um, he had some health issues, of course, it's been 15 odd years that we knew him, but in the last couple of years, he'd had some health issues where he didn't get around as much as he did when we first met him. And he was pretty much kind of, what do you want to say? He didn't leave his place much towards the end.
And Mr. Reader, you were aware that in around New Year's Day, he'd gone to hospital at Moruya, is that right?
That's correct. We, as like in my statement, we were actually on holidays with our family. Over that Christmas, we had left Boxing Day, and we were in Okinawa actually, with our family. I have 4 children, and all our kids try to get together at Christmas time.
So you were in
And
Japan?
We were in Japan, that's correct, in Okinawa. I have a daughter, my oldest son's wife is Japanese, and we had met in Okinawa.
And when did you first become aware of the bushfires in the South Coast?
Well, it was ongoing before we left on Boxing Day. We knew about the fires, but obviously we had this trip planned for 9 months, and all the tickets and accommodation and things. So we were a little hesitant to go. We'd had water issues. I mean, there was issues, but of course, you try to carry through with, your plans with your family. So we were aware of it. And while we were in Okinawa, we were made aware. We have a full-time staff. Well, I noticed I didn't really mention him in my statement, but he was looking after the farm. And we, when we realized, we actually had booked tickets back. We had changed our flight. We left about 5 days early.
And is that because of your concern about the fires? You wanted to be back on the property?
Yes. So we actually left New Year's Eve, to come back. That was before the fires hit, but we had booked our tickets like the night prior to that. So before the fires hit, we actually had changed our flights. So we had our tickets already, changed our tickets. So that would have been like the day before New Year's Eve. And then we flew out.
Sorry, Mr. Reader, if I take you from when you returned up to the 22nd and the 23rd of January, the fires were burning all that time, correct?
Well, the big fires was New Year's Eve day, as I remember. We arrived in Sydney New Year's Day, and we actually drove. At first we had actually booked flights from Sydney to Moruya and Rex Air, because we didn't think any of the highways were open to get to Moruya or, to our property. But then as it turned out, when we landed, we checked with live traffic and they had opened the highway through Cooma. So we drove from Sydney back to our place, not down the Princess Highway, but we drove through Canberra, through Cooma, and then down the coast. And then the road Cabargo, so we had to drive along from kind of Tathra up, a very roundabout way. I think it took us about 10 or 12 hours, and it was kind of touch and go. And we arrived home about 11 p.m. New Year's Day to the farm.
And you remained on the farm up until the 23rd of January, is that right?
That's correct. Our staff. He left at that time, and he didn't come back for about 4 days because there was the worry of the fires where he lived, and we didn't have any power. I mean, there were some serious issues, during that time, and then so he didn't come back for about 4 days after that. But then,
Mr. Reid, I just want to focus on taking it step by step, and I'm going to take you to the 23rd of January, if that's all right. And in your statement, you say, on 23rd of January, it felt like a normal day as we just went about our normal farming activities. Prior to this, hang on, just let me finish.
Okay,
just
go
let
ahead.
me, and then I'll ask you the question, okay? On 23rd of January 2020, it felt like a normal day as we just went about our normal farming activities. Prior to this day, the fire department had completed a large fire break to the west of our property, so we felt fairly safe where we were. Now, my question is, can you tell the court about the fire conditions on that day, that is the 23rd of January?
Well, that's what I was going to say. When I reread my statement last night, it wasn't a normal day. I don't remember saying that, but no, it was very windy, and it was incredibly windy that day of the 23rd. So it started out, normal, as in we got up and milked the cows, and the routine was normal. But then once we got done milking the cows, the wind picked up, and we have two dwellings in a place. It got so severe, the wind, that like you can imagine, we have like a wagon wheel kind of light fixture. It was blowing around. We had to tie it down, and then it was the very smoky and cloudy, and it felt different. And our staff left at about 11 o'clock because the conditions were deteriorating. This is before we were warned that the fire had jumped the fire break.
Well, that's what I'd like to come to that next. Is it the case that at about 12:30 some RFS members came to your property and suggested you either stay and protect the property or you evacuate?
That's correct.
And what did your wife do at that time?
Well, because we have to milk the cows, we just ate early so we could milk. We normally don't eat our main meal of the day until about 2:30, but on that day we ate early thinking we were going to milk the cows early while we still had power. So we were going to milk about 2 o'clock instead of at 3 o'clock, but that's about at 2 o'clock is when the ember attack hit.
But I'm just asking about your wife. Did she leave shortly after the RFS attended at your property?
No.
When did she leave?
Maybe she left when things kind of got, because the ember attack hit and we had spot fires all over and we were putting those out. And then the hill where Michael lived was on fire, and it was fire all around us.
Pause you there.
She left about 3:30 maybe.
Okay. So is it the case that the RFS members came around about 12:30 and then the conditions deteriorated throughout the afternoon, correct?
Yeah, when they came around...
I just want to take it step by step, Mr. Reader, because you were there, but we weren't there. So it makes it clearer if I can ask you. There was an ember attack. Can you describe how that happened to the court?
Well, just 1 minute it was just raining embers and there was fires everywhere, like everywhere. So there was fires like by our upper house, there was fires by the hay shed, there was fires by the dairy, there was post and rail fence, like a little post and rail fence between the dairy and our house was on fire, and the power, there was fire burning down the fence lines. There probably was 6 or 7 ignition points just around the buildings themselves, and the hay shed had fire. So there was just all these little spot fires, but also everything was on fire. All around us was on fire.
Were you attempting to put out those spot fires yourself?
Well, at first my wife was there. We went to get, at 2 o'clock, we went to get the cows. And then that was a biggie because the winds were huge. The winds were very, they blew the roof off part of the dairy. They blew the roof off the hay shed. They blew trees over and branches over. In our dairy yard, we have silky oak trees that kind of shade the dairy yard. It blew them over into the dairy yard, and then the cows at 2 o'clock, when we went to get the cows came running up into the yard, and then these trees were down, so obviously we couldn't milk, and so it all kind of happened at about 2 o'clock. So we chased them back out of the yard and, a couple hundred cows and all very agitated because of the fires and the smoke. We were able to get them back into a paddock along the creek, a fairly safe paddock. And once we got them, and then the fires were over, and then my wife decided she just wanted, he said, we gotta go. And so she was ready to leave. And I was still putting out these spot fires and was like, okay, I'll go when I get these fires. But then she left, and then I kind of got the fires put out, and then I started to leave. Well, I got in my ute and kind of was following her. But when I got to the point along the road where it goes into a very wooded area, where the bush kind of goes right down to the creek, there was already trees across the road. And I basically saw that and I said, well, I'm going to turn around and go back. I really wasn't that keen to leave anyhow. So I just turned around, and then she didn't see me. So she tried to turn around and come back to see what happened to me. Well, then because the trees were over the road already, she had to turn around again and she barely got out. And she got to the end of our road where she met up with our neighbor that lives at the end of the Bumble Road, which is about 5 kilometers. And then they went to Turras Heads.
I'll just pause you there. Was there a point later that day around 4 or 5 o'clock when you received a call from Shane Clark?
Yeah, that's correct.
And what did he say?
He said he had just got off the phone with Michael. He said Michael told him the shed outside was on fire, which they have like a shed outside their house. And then the phone line went dead. Michael's phone went dead.
And what did you do in response to that?
I told Shane, okay, I'll see what I can do. And so then maybe a short time, I kind of had all the spot fires put out enough where I felt like I could get away. Because, you could just I had a couple hoses. We were somewhat prepared because the Saturday after the New Year's Eve fires, there was a warning that it was going to be very, very bad. So what would that be? Whatever date that was. That didn't eventuate. We had a change of wind, but we were it got us to be very prepared. So all those preparations were more or less still in place. We had a couple holes, we were more or less prepared.
But Mr. Eder, I just want to ask you to tell the court what you did next in regard to Michael. Did you get on your quad bike and try and drive up there?
Yeah, yes, I did. Probably.
And how far did you get?
Well, I got across, actually, it worked out to be a lucky thing because there's a bridge that we cross about 200 meters east of our property where you cross Bumble Creek. So I went across that bridge, take a left where you start to go up in the bush on the tracks up to Michael's house, but there was trees all across those tracks on fire. And there was no way I was going to be able to get up to his property. But as I crossed the bridge, there was that fabric that they put for erosion control, and that was burning like a wick. And it was only about 1.5 meters from the bridge. So I went back and got a shovel and was able to put that fire out. Otherwise, the bridge would have burnt. As you know, almost every bridge between Bedell and Narragunda has burnt in the fires, or most timber bridges burnt in the fires.
And
then I came back. Go ahead.
Yep. Did you later go back up to the property and inspect where Michael's house had stood?
Yes, maybe 3 hours later, when I thought I had everything well and truly under control, and the ember attack had subsided by that time. At that time, I thought, oh, I got a little break. I'll go up and see what I can see, now. And I did get all the way up to his house. Is it the case that when you got there at that time, his house had been completely destroyed by fire? Yes, it had. The whole bush had burned, and all that was left standing was the chimney.
Thank you, Your Honour. That's the evidence of this witness.
Thank you, Ms Stevens. Mr Eder, I'll just see if there's any questions, any other questions for you. Mr Free.
No, Your Honour, thank you.
Mr Glascott.
Thank you, Your Honour. No, Your Honour, there's no questions.
Mr. Reader, that's the end of your evidence, and I thank you very much for making yourself available today and going through that very traumatic experience. You're excused now. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Your Honour, there are no further witnesses in this matter today. I make an application for this hearing to be adjourned for further evidence at a date to be fixed. We propose that on this later date we hear further evidence if necessary and also take a family statement from the Clark family.
Thank you, Ms Stevens, and to the Clark family. I understand that this must have been really difficult, the evidence and the opening that Ms Stevens gave today, and must have brought back some very difficult and traumatic memories for you. So our thoughts are with you all today, and I will adjourn this inquest to a later date.
Thank you, Your Honour. May we have a short adjournment in order to prepare for the next matter?
Yes, how long, just so people know?
Perhaps only 10 minutes, Your Honour.
All right, we'll resume at, we'll say 11:15.
Thank you.
Please all stand. This correspondence temporary adjourned.
December 2019. He died some weeks later, on 18 January 2020, from a heart attack while as an outpatient of Concord Recreation General Hospital. Ross was 84 years of age. We wish to acknowledge the presence of June Tarlington, one of Ross's children. She is watching the proceedings today. June lives in Cobargo and experienced the fires firsthand on her own property throughout that unforgettable New Year's Eve in 2019. We acknowledge her and, of course, Ross's other children and extend our condolences to each of them for their loss and to the Cobargo community more generally. Your Honour, Ross was born in the town of Milton on the south coast. He married and had 3 children. In the 1970s, he moved back to the Milton area. In 1995, Ross, with his wife Marjorie, rented a property on Cobargo Tip Road in Cobargo. Your Honour, I'll just bring up onto the screen now an aerial photograph that shows the house that Mr. Rickson resided in. Once Ross's children had grown up and had left home, Ross continued to live on this property with his wife Marjorie. His wife Marjorie died in 2011. Ross continued to live and work on the property up until the Black Summer bushfires. If it's convenient, Your Honour, I'll now read some short passages from June Tarlington's statement, which provides an insight into the life that Ross had lived. In 1972, Dad received news that his father, Spencer Rickson, was sick and dying, so we all travelled down in a big old Land Rover from Mitchell, Queensland, to Milton in New South Wales. Grandad was alive for about 3 months after our arrival, and in this time, Dad got a job as a mine prop cutter. Dad bought a 20 by 20 Burkmere tent, and we moved into the bush at the back of Milton called Brooman. Because Dad was given a tractor and a chainsaw, and we couldn't afford to return to Mitchell, Dad decided to move us into the bush. Dad and the family worked our way down the south coast in the forestry compartments allocated. Living in the bush was Mum, Dad, Patricia, Alan and me. Gloria was living in Toowoomba at the time and ended up moving into the bush with the rest of us. The family lived in the bush working our way down the south coast of New South Wales. When I was about 16, we were living in Red Creek, which is at the back of Wandella. By this time, Mum and Dad had bought a caravan and Dad had a ute and the Land Rover. We were living in a caravan and annex in Red Creek for about 2 years before we moved the caravan and annex to Wandella, to the next compartment. Dad continued to cut timber for mine props and eventually had to move from Wandella to Dingman's Creek and then to numerous other locations within the New South Wales south coast. There was plenty of work for Dad on the south coast due to the area being heavily timbered and lots of mine shafts being built. Mum and Dad continued to live in their caravan and annex. Around 1989, all the kids had moved on and Mum and Dad were on their own and Dad was away from camp most of the time working, so Mum became lonely. In 1989, I decided that Mum deserved better living conditions and I moved her from the camp to Ivy Cottage in Dingman's Creek. After moving Mum away from the campsite, Dad followed quite quickly and Dad also moved into Ivy Cottage in Dingman's Creek. Dad would have been 65 when he moved into the Ivy Cottage. Mum and Dad were now living in what would be classed as only a cottage, but they both became extremely happy with what was available to them, for example, electricity and a stove to cook on. Around the year 1990, they ceased using timber in the mine shafts and started using steel. This meant that Dad no longer had work in the mine industry, so Dad started cutting fence posts, shed posts and firewood. In about 1995, Mum and Dad moved out of Ivy Cottage and into a rental at Lot 4 Tip Road, Cobargo. This was a single-level dwelling consisting of 2 bedrooms, a bathroom and living room. Mum and Dad loved this place and went on to live there for the rest of their lives. Mum died on the 10th of January 2011 from heart failure. Dad was devastated after the passing of Mum, however continued to work. Dad worked up until the day he was injured as a result of the 2019-2020 bushfires. Dad was 84 years old and worked hard his whole life. There was never a moment in his adult life where he wouldn't be working and trying his hardest to provide his family with everything we needed. Your Honour, on the 26th of December 2019, Ross saw his daughter June Tullington and her family for a birthday celebration. June and her family are also residents of Cobargo. She has given to the New South Wales Police a statement about her father and the family, their understanding of the developing Badger Forest fire, the risk to the property in Cobargo, and her father's fire plan. In the days that followed, and as the fire spread, Ross collected his belongings in 2 utes behind a makeshift fire break on a hill on his property. On the evening of the 30th of December 2019, Ross spoke with his neighbours, Stephen and Helen Stafford. Stephen said in his statement to police, which is in the brief of evidence and before the court, that when we got home, Helen went and spoke with Ross and told him we were back. She told him that we were getting ready to leave if need be. She told me that Ross had also packed his truck and trailer ready to leave. The fire front of the Badger Forest fire approached Cobargo, as Your Honour knows, in the early hours of the morning of 31 December 2019. Ross contacted Stephen Stafford, the neighbour to which I referred a moment ago, to check they were leaving. Ross telephoned other neighbours to ensure they were all leaving their properties. In particular, Ross called another neighbour, James Neal. James was a neighbour and friend of Ross for 20 years. James Neal will give evidence shortly, Your Honour. He will explain that he was awoken by Ross yelling to him outside his house and beeping his car horn. He has informed investigating police that he considers that these actions by Ross saved his life. James Neal will also give evidence, Your Honour, that he left his own property and saw Ross drive back towards his own property, likely in his view to try and save him. As a result, Ross was exposed to the impending firestorm at the front of the Badger fire. He lost his property and sustained burns to his face. Your Honour, I now pause to show, Your Honour, the following photographs taken at Ross's house of the impending fire and its devastating aftermath. There was nothing, as Your Honour will see, left of Mr Nixon's home. Your Honour, his daughter June says in her statement to police, I have been told that after Dad had received these burns, they are the burns to his face, Your Honour, he went to Norm Reed's house and informed him he had been burnt and that he was going to the bakery to get a coffee. Such was the character of the man who has been described as a real Australian bushie and who was, we are told, as strong as an ox. In attempting to drive himself to the bakery, he was located by another neighbour, Shane Sweeney, in his car at a gate by a fallen tree. Mr Sweeney helped Ross into Cobargo and to the bakery. An ambulance was called and he was admitted to the South East Regional Hospital in Bega for treatment for his facial burns. On New Year's Day, Ross was admitted to the Concord Recreational General Hospital Burns Unit. The relevant medical records of Mr Nixon are included in the brief of evidence before Your Honour. Mr Nixon remained in hospital until the 6th of January 2020. He was then transferred into the hospital hostel and remained there as an outpatient. In the early hours of 18 January 2020, while at the hostel, Ross awoke with chest pains and had trouble breathing. He alerted his daughter, Patricia Lawson, who was with him at the hostel. Medical staff attended and performed CPR as he had stopped breathing. He was then admitted into the emergency department. Ross Rickson did not recover and died at the hospital at 3:24 a.m. on the 8th of January 2020. An autopsy was performed and the evidence will likely demonstrate that he suffered from ischemic heart disease. The post-mortem examination of the chest revealed that he had severe narrowing in the three main coronary arteries and there was evidence of an acute myocardial infarction. The forensic pathologist was of the opinion that the burns on the face had been healing well and did not contribute to the cause of the death. Your Honour, that concludes my opening remarks. If it's convenient, Your Honour, I call Mr James Neal.
Yes. Mr Neal, can you see and hear us?
Yes.
Thank you, and we can see and hear you. The court officer will now speak to you.
Mr Neal, I'm going to swear you in. Do you wish to take the oath or the affirmation?
The affirmation, please.
Silence, please. Do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say, I do.
I do.
Sir, would you please state your full name?
James Frederick Neal.
And have you provided a statement in relation to the matters before Her Honour dated the 10th of June but signed by you, also by you on the 10th of June 2020?
Yes, I have.
And Ross Rickson was well known to you, was he not?
Yes.
You considered him, as I understand it, a very good mate of yours.
Very good friend. Yes.
And you'd known Ross Rickson, had you not, for about 20 years or so?
Yeah, off and on 20 years, yeah. That's correct.
And were you a neighbour of Ross's?
Probably about 3 properties away.
And as the crow flies, how far from your house to his in that?
About 1 minute. As the crow flies, about a minute.
Thank you. Now, I just want to ask you some questions leading up to New Year's Eve in 2019. Do you remember when you first became aware that there was a forest fire in the Badger Forest area?
Yes, I woke up probably about 2:30 and I could feel the heat and I could hear it.
And was that on the early morning on the 31st of December 2019?
That's correct.
Before that, did you have any forewarning that there was a fire that may be heading your way before the 31st?
Yeah, on the 30th, there was all black soot and ash and everything falling on everyone in Cobargo.
And were you monitoring the development of that fire at any time before 2 a.m. on the 31st of December, Mr. Neal?
No, I completely underestimated it.
I'll return to that shortly. But had you been monitoring it, for example, on the Fires Near Me app?
Yes, I had. Yes.
And had you also been listening to news reports in relation to the progression of that fire that was moving your way from the Badger Forest?
Yes, I had.
Now, you said a moment ago that you'd underestimated it. What was your fire plan in relation to that fire that was heading your way on New Year's Eve 2019?
Well, I just packed my car the night, probably from about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I started packing my car. Then the night came, had tea, probably fell to sleep, on the lounge. Woke up, could feel the heat, underestimated it completely. Went to bed, then woke up to go to the toilet, could feel the heat and hear the noise. So I got a wet towel, put it around my face, sat down and went back to sleep. And that's when Ross came through down, bipping his horn and singing my name out, because I can't smell, and he knew that, so he probably would have thought that I didn't know the fire was coming.
You've been woken by Ross beeping his horn and yelling you to get out.
Yeah, that's correct.
At that time, when you got out of the house, are you able to describe what the conditions were like?
It's like hell. Fire everywhere, smoke everywhere, birds flying out of the sky. Yeah, it's pretty bad.
I'm sorry to bring these matters back up, Mr. Neal. What was the wind like? Was it strong or not?
It was just twirling around, coming from every direction, making great big twirly whirlies. Yeah, these big balls of fire getting thrown and catching. Yeah, it's just unbelievable.
Did you speak to Ross or not when he woke you up?
No, I didn't. I just jumped in my car and followed him. Virtually, I could see him. It was very smoky. I could see his headlights. And when I got to the top of my driveway, he turned right, going to go back down to his place. And I turned left onto the highway because I live on the highway. And I just went downtown and started putting fires out downtown. And then had to sleep on the side of the road. And then the police woke me up and asked me to go. And I said, no, I'm fighting fires. So then I started fighting. I went around and helped Paul at the back of the bakery. Yeah, just went around putting out spot fires everywhere for the rest of the night.
Did you see Ross again?
Yeah, I did. I went to the bakery to get some water, and then Ross pulled up, and he opened the door, and he was very burnt. His hair was all burnt. He wasn't well. He had a little dog, a little rescue dog, and he was so upset about that. Then we just sat him down and gave him a cup of coffee, and I said to Sandy, I said, you better call the ambulance, he's going to go into shock. Then the ambulance came, and yeah, then they put him in the ambulance, and that was the last I seen of Ross.
You've described him in your statement as a tough old bastard.
No,
Is that a fair description of him?
Very hard man, very honest.
And you worked with him, did you not, for a few years cutting timber?
Yeah, just cutting the wood and throwing it in the truck and loading it up and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it was great to work for.
And was he still cutting timber at the time of these terrible fires in late 2019?
Yes.
How else would you describe your mate Ross?
Just didn't take much. He didn't suffer idiots very well. He was very honest, always spoke the truth. Really kind to people that was good to him. Just a full-on good Australian bloke.
Did you have any discussions with Ross about what his fire plan was in those days leading up to New Year's Eve 2019 or not?
Not really. I just didn't. I think a lot of people were just completely surprised by how it came onto us so quickly.
Did you know that he parked a couple of utes up on a hilltop, or not?
When I seen Shane, when I seen Lee Sweeney, I said, "What happened?" And he said he found Ross. The wind had picked him up and threw him up against a tree, and Lee got there just as he was coming to and put him in the car and said, "Go downtown." That's when we found him downtown. He just pulled up downtown, yeah.
Mr. Neal, as I understand it, you unfortunately lost your house in those fires. That's so?
Yes, yes.
And at the time you gave your statement, which was June last year, you were living in a borrowed caravan. Is that right?
Yeah, still am.
And you still are you?
Yeah.
And is that because you're waiting for the new home to be built?
That's correct, yes.
Any idea when that new home may be built or not?
Probably late October, early November.
I imagine it's been hard going since December 2019 to date.
Yes, it has been, because I've been suffering from PTSD.
Yeah. I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Neal. Your Honour, that concludes Mr. Neal's evidence.
Mr. Neal, if you just wait one moment, I'll just see if there's any questions for you. Mr. Free?
No questions, Your Honour.
And Mr. Glascott?
No questions, Your Honour. Thank you.
Mr. Neal, thank you very much for making yourself available to give evidence today. I know it must have been really painful to go through that whole story again and to talk about the terribly tragic loss of your mate.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you. You're excused, Mr. Neal.
Thank you.
Your Honour, that concludes the formal evidence in relation to the inquest into the death of Ross Rickson. If it's convenient now, Your Honour, I'll read a family statement.
Thank you.
On behalf of June Tarlington, Ross's daughter. Ross Rickson, an iconic Australian bushman. Ross was born to Spencer and Annie Rickson. You see there before you, Your Honour, now a photograph of June and her father Ross. Spencer Rickson, that is Ross's father, was in the Royal Australian Air Force as a stores officer, but had a total belief that it was paramount that his sons have some time working on the land to upskill them and educate them to hard work. Ross left school at 14 and was sent to work as a cooper at the brewery. After gaining a good concept of this skill, that is barrel making, Spencer sent him to Queensland to work as a drover. He had been relinquished as an altar boy for drinking the holy wine, so his mischievous attitude was already shining bright. He worked as a drover, eventually settling in Western Queensland in a beef, sheep and cropping town of Mitchell. It was there he met a lovely widow with 4 children. They married and had another 3 children. Dad bought a truck and started his own trucking business, eventually going broke after a horrific bout of pneumonia. He then took up fencing contracting, where he worked for many of the large grazier-owned stations. His hard-working ability was well noted and he was never out of work. In 1972, by now there were still 4 children at home, and he got word his father was dying, so he loaded Dawn, his wife, 4 children and a dog called Yippee Bean into the old Land Rover ute and made the 1,500-mile trek to Milton, here in New South Wales, to see his father. Spencer didn't pass as quick as first thought, so Ross got a job cutting mine props in the forestry. His employer provided him with a 041 Stihl chainsaw and a T20 Massey Ferguson tractor. Ross went and bought a 20 by 20 Berkmere tent and the family moved into the bush and ended up staying in the bush forever. The children cut timber as well, not attending school from that time on. I'm writing this document and I'm the youngest, and at that time I was 10. We continued to cut mine props all the way down the coast, finally arriving in the bush at Wandella, 15 k's from Cobargo. Still living in a tent, but basically having a hard but great life. Ross loved hard work. He never differentiated between a boy or a girl. He taught us all to drive dozers, tractors and use chainsaws. I now come to a passage that relates to this particular photograph, Your Honour, where Your Honour sees Ross wearing the iconic Akubra hat. Ross and Dawn were a great team and very welcoming to anyone. Opportunity to have a yarn. On one occasion, a young woman and her partner and child moved into a shack near the camp, and she was in a troubled state. They came up to the work dump where Dad talked to them, asking them a million questions, as he always had a thirst for knowledge. A great friendship developed, and the young woman spent many hours talking to Dad or Mum, really just appreciating the fact they would listen. Eventually, she made a full recovery, and when she was doing a course at uni, she did a study on portraits. She asked could she take photos of Dad, which she did, and it is her photo of Dad that you see of him in his bush clothes and a Kubra at work in the bush. Ross had an incredible knowledge of the bush, its flora and fauna, and had a very high level of observation. Something he drilled into us kids. He often had a lengthy debate with a hippie, as he called them, as to their face when they wanted him to fell a tree so they could build a dwelling. If it was a precious seed tree, he would never fell it or allow them to fall it and make them choose a different one on their land. He only ever read factual books and would read all different styles of books, from history to biographies. He could read a huge book and retain most of the information. He had a battle with bowel cancer and had a large part of his bowel removed and had a bag, and once he got used to it, he still worked on just as hard. He was a type 1 diabetic, and his biggest hurdle with that was pricking his very callous fingers to test his sugar levels. All the medical staff loved him because he was so vibrantly fit. Dawn passed in 2011, which was a very tough time for him. She left him her little dog to mind, and when the little dog passed, he eventually got another little dog called Bella, whom he adored. And that's Bella you see there in that photograph, Your Honour. Ross was well liked around Cobargo. He always tipped his hat to all the ladies when he said hello, even if he knew them or not. In his funeral attendance book, there were over 500 signatures. At his funeral, I insisted to the priest we would have a 21 chainsaw salute. We started all the saws, family members and bush friends followed suit, creating the Mexican wave as I revved the saw, lifting it to face the sky to bid him farewell. The fire was such an horrific event for all of us. Some stayed and survived like us, but it was terrifying to be in. When we got up at 1 a.m. in the morning, I immediately rang Dad and said, "Dad, get up, get Bella and get out of there. This is really bad." Sadly, I rang 3 times and I never got him. He was already out waking neighbours up from a deep sleep, which in the end saved their lives. A story of great bush skills, which is so Dad and I cherish, is that he loaded his 2 utes up with his chainsaws and block splitters and parked them up on the ridge away from his house. He then got in his little town car and went around and around the utes doing burnouts, tearing up the grass so the earth was bare around the utes, so the fire couldn't burn them. They both were saved. We were like zombies trying to sort out stock milk cows with no power, just a tractor, no water and rebuild fences. It was a dreadful day when we got the news that he had passed from a heart attack. He is sadly missed by all his family and the entire community. Your Honour, he was known as Rico the Legend.
I want to thank you, June, for those beautiful words about your father. And I also just want to acknowledge those of you who are listening in who loved Ross, family and friends, and also the whole community there at Cobargo who went through hell, really, on that New Year's Eve. So thank you for those beautiful words about your father, who truly was a legend.
Your Honour now has the benefit of the documentary material contained within Exhibit 5 and the oral testimony from Detective Senior Constable Glenn Bradley, given earlier this week, together with Mr Rickson's neighbour's evidence, that is Mr Neal's, who you've just heard from now. Your Honour also has the benefit of hearing the words of June Tarlington, one of Ross's daughters, by way of a family statement. At a later stage in Your Honour's inquiry into the 2019-2020 bushfire season, those assisting Your Honour will formally address Your Honour on the manner and cause of Mr Rickson's death. In that regard, Your Honour, I can foreshadow now that a formal submission is likely to be made that Ross Rickson died at approximately 3:24 a.m. on 18 January 2020 at Concord Recreation General Hospital, Hospital Road, Concord here in Sydney. The cause of death was ischemic heart disease, which he suffered while being treated as an outpatient for facial burns sustained on the 31st of December 2021 during the Badger Forest fire. 2019, Your Honour. Your Honour, that concludes this inquest, other than I would respectfully ask that this matter also be stood over generally to Stage 2 of Your Honour's inquiry to Monday the 5th of September 2022.
I'll do that. I'll stand this matter over to the next stage, Stage 2.
Your Honour, that concludes today's proceedings. Tomorrow, Your Honour, has listed for hearing the inquest into the death of Richard Steele. My learned junior, Ms Stevens, will open that inquest. Two witnesses are to be called, Mr Berger and Ms MacDonald, and a family statement will also be received. And then, Your Honour, we'll move into the inquest into the death of John Smith, and a number of witnesses will be called in relation to that inquest. Mr Rogan, Mr Clark and Mr Nelson, together with a family statement, Your Honour.
Thank you, Mr Castleton. We'll adjourn now and resume at 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Please, the Court.
Silence, please, all stand.